I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was at my desk, catching up on the bank balance and wondering if the price of Shad Row was ever going to stop its upward climb when the doorbell rang. It was 11:04 a.m. Up on the roof, Nero Wolfe was currently engaged in the one activity he considers more important than eating or insulting the district attorney. He was with Theodore Horstman and 10,000 orchids. Wolfe doesn't like the doorbell ringing during his plant room hours, and he likes it even less when the ringer doesn't have an appointment. I checked the monitor. Standing on the stoop was a man who looked like he'd been put together from spare parts found in a Victorian attic. He was wearing a tweed suit that had seen better decades and was clutching a wooden crate to his chest as if it contained the crown jewels or a very fragile bomb. I went to the door, pulled it open, and kept the chain on. "Yes, I must see Mr. Wolfe," the man said. He had a voice like sandpaper on dry leaves. "It is a matter of life, death, and preservation, mostly preservation. Mr. Wolfe is currently occupied with a Cattleya mossiae," I told him, "and unless you are a parasite currently eating it, he won't be down until 1 o'clock. I'm Archie Goodwin. I handle the people who don't have petals." The man looked at me, his eyes darting to the crate. "You're the one who does the legwork. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I am a taxidermist by trade, though I prefer the term biological preservationist. Someone is trying to kill me, Mr. Goodwin, but more importantly, someone has altered my pelican." I unlatched the chain. Any man who leads with an altered pelican is either a lunatic or exactly the kind of headache Wolfe deserves on a Tuesday. I led him into the office, offered him the red leather chair which he sat on as if he expected it to bite back and waited. "Explain the pelican," I suggested, sitting behind my desk and reaching for a notepad. Penhaligon placed the crate on the floor and pried the lid open with fingers that were stained a permanent chemical yellow. He reached in and pulled out a stuffed brown pelican. It was a masterpiece of the craft, looking ready to dive into the carpet for a stray sardine, except for one detail. "Look at the left eye," Penhaligon whispered. I leaned in. The right eye was a standard glassy orb. The left eye, however, had a faint metallic sheen behind the pupil. "I didn't put that eye in," Penhaligon said, his voice trembling. "I completed this commission for Mr. Halloway 3 days ago. Last night, someone broke into my shop. They didn't take the silver. They didn't take the ledger. They swapped the eye of this bird. And this morning, I found a man watching my shop from a black Sedana man with a scar that runs from his ear to his jaw. I looked at the bird. It stared back, indifferent to the fact that it was now a piece of evidence." "And why Wolfe?" I asked. "Because," Penhaligon said, "Mr. Halloway is the Under-Secretary of State, and if he finds out his trophy has been bugged, or whatever this is, he'll never work again. But there's more. The man with the scar. I saw him at the Halloway estate 2 weeks ago. He was the butler." I heard the elevator groan. The clock on the wall hit 1. The doors slid open, and 1/7 of a ton of genius stepped out, wearing a yellow silk shirt that could have doubled as a distress signal for a downed pilot. Wolfe stopped short, his eyes traveling from the visitor to the pelican on the floor. His lips compressed. "Archie, why is there a prehistoric bird in my office?" "It's a pelican, New York's finest example of the craft," I said, gesturing to our guest. "Mr. Penhaligon here says it's been tampered with. It seems the Under-Secretary of State's butler is interested in taxidermy, and Mr. Penhaligon is interested in not being murdered." Wolfe crossed the room, his gait measured and heavy. He ignored Penhaligon entirely and leaned over the pelican. "He didn't touch it. Wolfe doesn't touch things he doesn't have Tobbit." He peered at the left eye. "A micro-lens," Wolfe murmured, more to himself than to us, "or a storage medium. Indubitably sophisticated." He straightened up, his face a mask of settled gloom. "Mr. Penhaligon, I do not take cases involving stuffed poultry. He says the butler has a scar," I added helpfully, "and he's being followed." Wolfe turned his gaze to Penhaligon. "You mentioned intellectual justice in your note to my orchid room, which Archie conveniently ignored." "I didn't send a note," Penhaligon blinked. Wolfe froze. He slowly turned his head toward the small table near the door, where the mail is usually placed. There, tucked under a paperweight, was a small, cream-colored envelope that hadn't been there when I went to the door. Someone had entered the brownstone, or at least reached through the mail slot while I was talking to the taxidermist. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. The sanctity of the house had been breached. The pelican was no longer just a bird, it was a trespass. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave into that dangerous territory that usually means my shoes are going to get a workout. "Lock the door. Mr. Penhaligon, sit down. Tell me everything about Mr. Halloway's household, and do not omit the brand of cigars he smokes. If someone wishes to turn my home into a post office for their intrigues, I shall make them regret the postage." I didn't need to be told twice to lock the door. I threw the deadbolt, walked over to the small table by the rack, and picked up the cream-coloured envelope. I held it strictly by the edges, though if the person who slipped it through the slot had the brains to implant a storage device in a stuffed pelican, they probably weren't leaving thumbprints for Inspector Kramer's squad to admire. I carried the envelope back to my desk, slit it open with the silver paper knife, and extracted a single sheet of heavy, expensive stock. There was a typed message, crisp and perfectly centered. I read it aloud so the genius behind the custom-made desk could hear every insolent syllable. "Mr. Wolfe, your expertise is renowned, but this matter requires discretion, not investigation. Return the avian artifact to its rightful owner by 3 o'clock, and Mr. Penhaligon's imaginative fears will be dismissed. Interfere, and the consequences will be both political and permanent." Wolfe let out a sound that was half a heavy sigh and half an irritated grunt. He leaned back slowly, closing his eyes, his massive hands resting firmly on the arms of his chair. "They threaten me in my own home, Archie. They violate my vestibule, they dictate my schedule, and they use the absurd phrase avian artifact when they mean a stuffed bird. Phooey. That alone is unforgivable." He opened his eyes and leveled them at the trembling taxidermist, who looked as if he was about to faint directly into the wastebasket. "Mr. Penhaligon, you are no longer merely a prospective client, you are now my excuse to correct a severe breach of manners. Who exactly resides in Mr. Halloway's house? Be precise, and do not mumble." Penhaligon swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Well, there is Mr. Halloway himself, of course. A very stern, demanding man. Then there is his chief of staff, Mr. Trenchard. Trenchard handles all household logistics, private schedules, security arrangements. He is the one who actually commissioned the pelican for Halloway's study. Then there is the butler, the man with the scar. His name is Graves." "Graves," I said from my desk. "Subtle. I suppose he lurks in the shadows." "And Mr. Halloway's niece, Miss Evelyn," Penhaligon added hastily, wiping his pale forehead with a crumpled handkerchief that had seen better days. "She lives there too. She was the one who let me in when I delivered the bird 2 days ago. She seemed terribly nervous about the whole thing, pacing the hall while I set it on the pedestal." Wolfe pressed the button under his desk to ring for Fritz. When Fritz appeared, looking mildly alarmed at the sight of the giant aquatic bird sitting on the fine Persian rug, Wolfe ordered a bottle of beer. "We have an imposed deadline of 3 o'clock, Archie. It is currently 1:20. We will certainly not be returning the bird. Therefore, we must assume the arrogant authors of that note will shortly come to us to retrieve it." He didn't have to wait long. At exactly 1:40, the doorbell rang. I checked the panel in the hall. Standing on the stoop was a tall, distinguished man in a charcoal suit who radiated the kind of expensive authority that usually comes with a government pension, and a famously bad temper. Flanking him were 2 younger men. One was built like a middleweight boxer in a cheap grey suit, sporting a jagged white scar along his jawline. Graves, no doubt. The other was sharp-featured, wearing a tailored navy suit and gripping a leather briefcase. Trenchard. I stepped back into the office. "The United States Department of State is currently standing on our stoop," I announced, complete with the scarred butler and the anxious chief of staff. "Let them in," Archie, Wolfe murmured. He didn't shift his considerable weight. He didn't adjust his yellow tie. He simply sat, an immovable mountain of flesh and intellect, ready to let the invasion crash against him. I opened the front door, leaving the chain off. Halloway stepped into the hall without waiting for an invitation, his cold eyes sweeping the woodwork before landing hard on me. "I am Under Secretary Halloway. I believe you have something of mine, and someone. We have a lot of things," I said cheerfully, not moving out of his way, "including a very comfortable waiting room, but Mr. Wolfe is expecting you." Try not to break anything. I ushered them into the office. The air instantly thickened. Halloway stopped dead when he saw the pelican on the floor. Then his gaze snapped to Penhaligon, who shrank deep into the red leather chair. Graves stepped slightly to the left, his eyes locking onto me. I gave him a pleasant smile and moved so my right hand was an inch closer to my jacket pocket. Trenchard stayed right behind his boss, his face an unreadable mask. Wolfe took a deliberate sip of his beer, set the glass down, and wiped his lips with his handkerchief. He didn't offer them a seat. He simply looked at them, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. "Mr. Halloway," Wolfe finally said softly, "you have crossed my threshold, and your associates have polluted my mail slot. Start explaining." Under-Secretary Halloway possessed the kind of face that belonged on a bronze coin minted during a particularly brutal war. He glared at Wolfe, unaccustomed to men who remained seated in his presence. "I owe you no explanations, Mr. Wolfe. I demand the return of my property." Halloway's voice was a cold chisel. Wolfe sighed, an expulsion of air that signaled profound boredom. "Mr. Halloway, you are laboring under a misconception. You do not dictate terms in my office. You attempted to intimidate me with an anonymous note. You failed. You now attempt to browbeat me with your title. You are failing again. The pelican remains precisely where it is until I am satisfied. If you find this unacceptable, the door is behind you. Archie will gladly show you how the knob operates." Trenchard, the sharp-featured chief of staff, stepped forward, his leather briefcase held like a shield against the tension in the room. "Now see here, Wolfe, this is a matter of national security. That object contains highly sensitive surveillance equipment." "Bah," Wolfe said. "It contains a camera and a transmitter. The taxidermist, Mr. Penhaligon, whom your scarred associate has been stalking, discovered it. The question is not what it is, but who placed it there, and why they chose to violate my vestibule with their frantic ultimatums. If it were an official State Department operation, you would not be standing on my carpet demanding secrecy. You are terrified of a scandal." Halloway's jaw muscles ticked. He glanced at Trenchard, then Graves. The butler remained as still as a statue, his eyes cold and empty, but I caught the slight shifting of his weight. He was a coiled spring. "It was a gift," Halloway said finally, his voice dropping a fraction of a decibel, "from a retiring ambassador. It sat in my private study. 3 days ago, I noticed the angle of the glass I had changed. I had it examined discreetly. Someone inside my own house has been monitoring my conversations. I sent it to Penhaligon under the guise of needing the feathers cleaned, hoping to draw out the operative when the device was vulnerable." Wolfe picked up his beer, poured a precise 2 inches into the glass, and watched the foam settle, a remarkably clumsy tactic. "And when the bird was out of your house, someone broke into the shop to retrieve or alter the device, and you assume it was someone in your household." "It has to be," Trenchard interjected, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Only a few people have access to the study. Myself, Graves, and Miss Evelyn." Wolfe's eyes narrowed into slits. "And yet, you brought 2 of your prime suspects with you to my office. Either you are a fool, Mr. Halloway, or you are orchestrating a pageant for my benefit. I suspect the latter." Graves took a half-step forward. "You watch your tone," he rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. "I didn't draw my gun, but I made sure he saw my hand slip into the pocket where I keep the Smith & Wesson. Easy, Scarface," I told him. "Mr. Wolfe's tone is a registered landmark. It doesn't change for anybody." Halloway held up a hand, stopping the butler. "We are wasting time. Will you return the bird or not?" "Not today," Wolfe murmured. "I have been dragged into your domestic espionage. I do not appreciate being a pawn in a game I did not consent to play. Therefore, I will take the case. I did not hire you," Halloway snapped. "Mr. Penhaligon hired me," Wolfe corrected, nodding at the taxidermist who was practically trying to merge with the red leather chair. "He feels his life is in danger. To secure his safety, I must unravel your mess. My fee will be substantial, and you will pay it, Mr. Halloway, because the alternative is my releasing this avian anomaly to the press. Archie will visit your home tonight to inspect this menagerie of yours. He will speak with your niece. He will examine the study. You will give him full access, or you will read about your pelican in the Morning Gazette. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the floorboards. Holloway looked at Wolfe, measuring the man, realizing he had finally hit a wall he couldn't bulldoze. He turned on his heel. 9 o'clock, Holloway said over his shoulder. If your man breaks anything, I will have him arrested. As they marched, Wolfe closed his eyes. Orage, get that ridiculous bird out of my sight. And tell Fritz I will need extra onions in the sauce tonight. I have a sudden distaste for diplomats. The Holloway residence was a 4-story limestone fortress on the Upper East Side. It looked like it required a password and a blood sample just to ring the bell. I arrived at exactly 8:58, taking a taxi to avoid giving Graves the satisfaction of seeing me walk up the avenue. The night air was crisp, carrying the smell of roasted nuts from a street cart a block away, though I doubted anyone in this neighborhood ate anything not presented on a silver platter. I pressed the bell. It did not chime, it buzzed with a low, authoritative hum. Seconds later, the heavy oak door swung open, revealing the scarred butler. Graves looked even less thrilled to see me on his turf than he had in Wolfe's office. "Good evening," I said, stepping past him before he could decide to block the way. "Archie Goodwin, here to inspect the nest." "Mr. Trenchard is waiting in the study," Graves said, closing the door. He did not offer to take my coat. I followed his broad back down a hallway panelled in dark wood that probably cost more than my annual salary. The study was exactly what you would expect from a man who thought he could order Nero Wolfe. It featured leather volumes, heavy mahogany furniture, and a persistent odor of expensive tobacco and impending doom. Trenchard was standing by an empty marble pedestal near the window, checking his gold wristwatch. "You are prompt," Trenchard said, snapping his briefcase shut. He seemed perpetually ready to flee a scandal. "Mr. Wolfe runs on a strict schedule," I replied, crossing to the pedestal. "I assume this is where the bird roosted." "It is. And as you can see, there is nothing else of interest here." I ignored him and started my routine. I do not look for secret compartments right away. I look for dust, scuff marks, and what does not belong. The window behind the pedestal was locked, but the sill showed a faint, semicircular scratch, as if someone had hastily dragged a heavy piece of equipment over the ledge. I filed that away. "Who dusts this room?" I asked, looking under the rim of the pedestal. "The maids," Trenchard said impatiently, under Graves' strict supervision. Before Trenchard could formulate a bureaucratic brush-off, the heavy library door clicked open. A young woman stepped in. She had dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a simple navy dress. She possessed the kind of pale, tense beauty that comes from living in a house full of secrets and loud voices. "Mr. Trenchard," she corrected herself quickly. "My uncle is asking for the evening briefs." Trenchard's sharp features tightened. "I will be right there, Evelyn. Please leave us. This is official business." "Actually," I said, giving her my best trustworthy investigator smile, "Mr. Wolfe specifically asked me to speak with Miss Holloway. Trenchard, do not let the briefs get cold on my account." Trenchard glared, but the mention of Holloway's demands won out. He left the door slightly ajar. I nudged it shut with my foot. "Miss Holloway," I said softly, "you let Penhaligon the taxidermist in when he delivered the pelican. He told me you seemed highly nervous." She crossed her arms, rubbing her elbows. "I was not nervous about the bird, Mr. Goodwin. I was nervous because I knew why my uncle sent it. He suspects everyone. Does he have reason to?" She let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Always. But the camera was not my uncle's enemies in Washington. That was someone inside. You sound very sure of that." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "3 nights ago, before the pelican was sent to the shop, I came downstairs for a book. I heard voices in the study. My uncle and Trenchard. They were arguing about an offshore account not on any official disclosure forms. My uncle told Trenchard that if the press found out, they were both utterly ruined." I raised an eyebrow. "And who else knew about this argument?" "I do not know," she whispered. "But the next morning my uncle found the camera in the bird. He panicked, and Graves has been acting strangely since. He bought a new car yesterday, paying entirely in cash. A butler with a sudden influx of cash, a chief of staff hiding offshore accounts, and a niece wandering the halls at the perfect time to hear a motive for blackmail." I pulled out my notebook and jotted down a single word: leverage. "Thank you, Miss Holloway," I said, putting the pad away. "You have been very helpful." I left the study perfectly satisfied. I had 3 liars and a motive, exactly the kind of meal Nero Wolfe liked to chew on. I returned to the brownstone at 11:15. The lights in the office were still burning, a sure sign that Wolfe's curiosity had managed to overcome his desire for his 11 o'clock sleep. He was seated at his desk, a small stack of books on European history pushed to one side, replaced by a glass of milk and a plate of Fritz salted crackers. He didn't look up as I entered, but I saw his nostrils flare, a sure sign he was waiting for the report. "The Holloway Fortress is as cheerful as a tomb," I said, tossing my hat onto the rack, "and twice as crowded with skeletons. Trenchard is sweating through his expensive shirts. Graves is suddenly flush with cash for new automobiles, and the niece, Evelyn, is listening at keyholes. She claims Holloway and Trenchard are hiding an offshore account that isn't exactly in the public record." Wolfe grunted a short, sharp sound of dismissal. "Financial impropriety in a diplomat's house is as common as dust, Archie. It is a motive for many things, but it does not explain the specific clumsiness of the pelican. Is the bird still in the front room?" "Where you left it," I said, moving toward the kitchen to see if Fritz had left anything worth raiding. "Why? Bring it here." I went into the front room, fetched the crate, and set the stuffed pelican on the small table next to Wolfe's desk. He looked at it with a distaste that suggested the bird had personally insulted his lineage. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a magnifying glass, leaning forward with the slow, deliberate grace of a shifting tectonic plate. "Archie, observe the base." I leaned in. The wooden base of the taxidermy mount was solid oak. Near the bird's rear left claw was a tiny, jagged splinter missing. It wasn't just a scratch, it was a fresh wound in the wood. "Penhaligon didn't mention that," I noted. "Because it wasn't there when he delivered it," Wolfe murmured. "Nor was it there this afternoon. Look closer at the bird's plumage, just above the tail feathers." I took the glass from him. Tucked deep into the feathers was a tiny, translucent flake. It looked like a dried bit of leaf, but when I touched it with the tip of my pocket knife, it felt oily. "It's a spice," I said, sniffing the tip of the blade. "Marjoram, dried but high quality." Wolfe straightened up, his eyes gleaming with a cold, intellectual fire. "Precisely. Fritz uses marjoram in the lamb, but he keeps his spice jars in a sealed cabinet. Someone has been in this office, Archie. Someone who possesses a very specific and very desperate interest in this bird." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The brownstone is my territory. I know every creak in the floorboards and every hum of the elevator. "I was gone for 2 hours," I said, my voice dropping. "Fritz was in the kitchen. Theodore was in the basement. You were up with the orchids until 9, then you were here." "I was in the dining room for 40 minutes, Wolfe said. "Fritz was with me, serving the endive. The front door was locked, the bolt was thrown, and the security chain was engaged. Yet someone entered, handled this creature with enough haste to splinter the base, and left a trace of the kitchen's inventory behind. I checked the windows. Locked. I checked the back door leading to the small courtyard. Locked. I went into the kitchen. Fritz was cleaning the copper pots, his face pale when I told him someone might have been in the house. He swore he hadn't heard a sound, but he had spent 20 minutes in the basement pantry fetching the preserves. I went back to the office. Wolfe was staring at the pelican as if he expected it to speak. If they didn't take the device in the eye, what were they looking for? They weren't looking for anything, Archie. They were confirming something. The splinter was not caused by a tool, but by a ringer-heavy signet ring, I suspect, caught in the grain during a moment of agitated tactile exploration. As for the marjoram, it is a clumsy trail, too clumsy. He leaned back, his eyes closing. "We have been moved, Archie. Like chessmen on a board we cannot see. Someone has breached our sanctuary not to steal, but to signal their presence. They want us to know that our walls are not as thick as we believe. So what's the next move?" I asked, reaching for the phone. "I can have Saul Panzer here in 20 minutes. "Call him," Wolfe said, "and tell him to bring his heaviest coat. He will be spending the night in the shadows across the street. If the brownstone is to be a theatre, I want to know who is buying the tickets." Saul Panzer arrived at midnight, looking like a man who had spent his life blending into the greyest parts of the city. He didn't ask questions, he took the instructions, accepted a glass of milk and a sandwich from Fritz, and vanished into the darkness of West 35th Street. By dawn, the brownstone felt less like a sanctuary and more like a besieged outpost. I didn't sleep well. Every time a floorboard groaned, I was half convinced a diplomatic assassin was lurking in the hallway, possibly armed with more dried marjoram and a grudge. I was down in the office at 8, pounding out a report on the typewriter, when the phone rang. It was Saul. He had spent 6 hours in a doorway across the street, and he had seen a show. At 2:12 in the morning, a black sedan had cruised past slowly 3 times. On the 4th pass, a man had stepped out, not at our door, but at the house 3 doors down. He had climbed the fire escape with the agility of a cat, reached the roofline, and traversed the interconnected tops of the brownstones. Did he come down the hatch? I asked, my grip tightening on the receiver. He didn't need to. Saul's voice was steady. He spent 20 minutes near your chimney, Archie. Then he went back the way he came. I followed the car to a garage in Queens. It's registered to a holding company called Global Logistics. That's a front for Holloway's private security detail. I hung up and went upstairs. Wolfe was already in the plant room, standing over a bench of odontoglossum. The air was thick, humid, and smelled of damp earth and expensive rot. Theodore was busy at the far end, ignoring us as usual. I gave Wolfe the news. He didn't move a muscle, but his eyes, fixed on a spotted petal, seemed to turn a shade darker. The roof, Wolfe murmured. They didn't enter through the door, Archie. They didn't need to. They utilized the service elevator for the roof access of the neighboring property. But why the chimney? It is April. The dampers are closed, but not sealed. A sophisticated microphone lowered through the flue could turn this office into a sounding board. So they heard everything we said last night about the spice and the splinter, I said. Which means they know we're onto them. Or they know exactly what we want them to believe, Wolfe countered. He turned away from the orchids, his face a mask of cold fury. Archie, we are being toyed with by amateurs who possess professional tools. It is an intolerable combination. The breach in the office was a diversion, intended to make us look at the bird while they established a permanent listening post. They want to know my strategy before I deploy it. He started toward the elevator, his movements unusually brisk. We will not dismantle their device. Let them listen. In fact, let us give them a performance worth their surveillance. Call Mr. Holloway. Tell him that I have made a discovery of such magnitude that I cannot trust it to the telephone or the mail. Tell him that at 4 o'clock today, I will be prepared to hand over the Pelican and the information it contains, but only in the presence of his entire household. If anyone is missing, the deal is off, and if they don't come, they will come. They cannot afford to let me speak to the authorities, and they cannot afford to let each other out of their sight. The suspicion I planted yesterday has ripened. Now, we shall provide the heat to make it burst. I spent the next 2 hours making the calls and feeling like a stage manager for a play that might end in a shooting. Holloway roared, Trenchard wheezed, and even Evelyn sounded breathless when I told her the news. By 3 o'clock, the office was prepared. I had checked every corner for more avian artifacts and found nothing. Wolfe was back in his chair, a fresh beer bottle on the tray. He looked entirely composed, but I knew the signs. He was vibrating with a silent internal energy. He had stopped reading his books. He was staring at the Pelican, which I had placed back on its crate in the center of the room. Archie, he said, without looking at me, make sure your desk drawer is unlocked, and when they arrive, pay no attention to the bird. Watch the hands. Always the hands. A man can lie with his tongue and his eyes, but his fingers will always betray his heartbeat. The doorbell rang at 3:58. The hunters had arrived, and they brought the silence of the grave with them. I went to the door, wondering which one of them had been crawling across the rooftops while I was trying to dream. It was time to see if Wolfe's trap had more teeth than the pelican's beak. The 4 of them filed into the office like defendants entering a courtroom where the judge had already decided on the rope. Holloway led the pack, his face the color of a bruised plum, followed by Trenchard, who looked as though he'd spent the afternoon vibrating. Evelyn took the chair furthest from her uncle, her eyes darting between Wolfe and the stuffed pelican. Graves brought up the rear, his scarred face as immobile as a granite cliff, but his hands were tucked deep into his pockets. I took my post at my desk, leaving the drawer just slightly ajar so I could reach the Smith Wesson without making a theatrical production out of it. Wolfe didn't greet them. He sat behind his desk, his eyes half closed, appearing for all the world like a man about to nod off during a particularly dull sermon. The silence in the room stretched until it became a physical weight. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the war clock and the faint, wet sound of Trenchard swallowing his nerves. It's a trick Wolfe uses, lets the suspects build their own gallows out of the quiet. I have spent the last few hours, Wolfe began, his voice barely above a murmur, reflecting on the nature of preservation. Mr. Penhaligon preserves the physical forms of creatures that have ceased to breathe. You, Mr. Halloway, attempt to preserve a political reputation that is, by all accounts, already decaying. And someone in this room is attempting to preserve a secret by turning my home into a laboratory for espionage. Halloway leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the arms of his chair. I didn't come here for a lecture on philosophy, Wolfe. You said you made a discovery. Hand over the information and the bird, and let's end this farce. The farce ended at 2:00 this morning, Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing open. When a member of your security detail scaled my roof to plant a listening device in my chimney. It was a remarkably athletic display of incompetence. You see, I do not react well to being monitored. It encourages me to look much deeper than I originally intended. Trenchard's head snapped toward Halloway. The roof, sir? You said he cut himself off, but the damage was done. The air in the room shifted. Suspicion, which had been a general fog, suddenly crystallized into a sharp, jagged edge. Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his middle. Mr. Trenchard, your agitation is noted. You are worried about offshore accounts. Miss Evelyn, you are worried about your uncle's temper and your own future. And Graves? Graves is worried about the mileage on his new car. But none of those things explains why the Pelican had to be tampered with after it arrived in this office. I watched Graves. His jaw tightened, the scar on his face turning a vivid, angry red. He didn't look at Wolfe, he looked at the Pelican. You see, Wolfe continued, the camera in the eye was a clumsy distraction, a stalking horse, I believe the term is. Its purpose was to be found. It gave Mr. Halloway a reason to send the bird to a taxidermist, and it gave the real culprit a reason to follow it. The true prize was never the eye. It was the interior. A pelican is a large bird, and its pouch and body cavity provide ample space for something far more valuable than a micro-lens. Wolfe gestured toward me. I stood up, walked to the table, and picked up the pelican. Following the instructions Wolfe had whispered to me 10 minutes prior, I didn't look at the eye. I flipped the bird and pointed to the base where the splinter had been. When I was at the house, I told the room, I noticed a scratch on the windowsill in the study. It matched the splinter on this base. Someone didn't just move this bird, they dropped it in a hurry because they heard someone coming, and when they dropped it, the real contents rattled. Enough, Halloway shouted, standing up. This is nonsense. There is nothing in that bird but wire and straw. Then you won't mind if Archie performs a bit of surgery, Wolfe said coldly, though I doubt it will be necessary. The man who climbed my roof wasn't there to listen. He was there to see if we had found the real ledger of the Global Logistics Holding Company, which was sewn into the lining of the bird's chest before it ever left your house. A ledger that contains the names of every foreign agent you've been consulting with, Mr. Halloway. The explosion didn't come from Halloway. It came from Trenchard, who lunged not for Wolfe, but for the door. I was faster. I was out from behind my desk and blocking the exit before he could even reach the rug's edge. Graves moved too, but he didn't help his boss. He stepped toward Halloway, his hand coming out of his pocket with a heavy, professional-looking snub nose. "Stay down, Arthur," Graves rasped, his eyes on the undersecretary. "The game is up. Mr. Wolfe has been very educational." Wolfe didn't even flinch at the sight of the gun. He simply sighed and reached for his beer. "Archie, please call Inspector Kramer. Tell him to bring a very large van. We have a collection of predators to export." The office became a frozen tableau of a collapsing empire. Trenchard was pinned against the door, his breath coming in ragged, desperate hitches, while Graves held the snub nose leveled at Halloway's chest with the practiced ease of a man who had long since traded his soul for a steady paycheck. Undersecretary Holloway had gone from a pillar of government authority to a crumbling ruin of grey skin and shaking hands. He stared at the pelican, the ridiculous, stuffed aquatic bird as if it were the mouth of a cannon. "Put the weapon away, Graves," Wolfe said, his voice flat and unimpressed. Violence in this room is not only unnecessary, it is a tedious interruption of my dinner schedule. You are not protecting justice, you are merely attempting to pivot your loyalty to whichever side offers the best immunity. It is a pathetic display. Graves didn't lower the gun, but he didn't fire. I kept my own hand on the Smith Wesson in my pocket, watching the butler's eyes. A man with a scar like that usually gets it from a lack of caution, and I didn't want him trying to even the score in our office. "You're wrong about one thing, Wolfe," Graves rasped. "I didn't climb your roof to listen. I climbed it to make sure Trenchard hadn't sent someone else to get that ledger back. I've been watching him for months. I knew he was skimming from the global accounts, but I didn't know he'd hidden the proof in the bird until the taxidermist started getting jumpy. Liars are always so eager to correct the footnotes of their failures," Wolfe remarked, lifting his glass to catch the light. "Mr. Trenchard, you may stop trying to vibrate through the woodwork. The door is locked, and Mr. Goodwin is remarkably efficient at physical restraint. Sit down." Trenchard collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "It wasn't just me," he moaned. "Holloway knew. He authorized the consultation fees. I just handled the logistics. The Pelican was supposed to be a safe way to move the hard ledger out of the office during the internal audit. We never thought a senile taxidermist would notice a substituted eye. I am not senile." Penhaligon chirped from his corner, suddenly finding a spark of dignity now that the giants were falling. Wolfe ignored the outburst. He turned his attention back to Holloway, who was slumped in his chair, looking aged by 20 years. "You, sir, are a specialist in power optics. You believe that by creating a secondary Mysterious camera in the IU could mask the primary crime. If the bird were intercepted, the spy would be the story, not the contents of the bird's chest. You even utilized your niece's presence to add a layer of domestic confusion, knowing her habit of eavesdropping would eventually reach the wrong ears and create a smokescreen of family secrets to hide your treason." Evelyn stood up, her face pale, but her voice steady. "He used me as a witness to his own staged arguments. Every time I heard something, it was because he wanted me to repeat it to the wrong people. He wanted the world to think he was being blackmailed, not that he was the one doing the selling." "Precisely," Wolfe murmured, "a sophisticated piece of theatre. But theatre requires a stage, and you were foolish enough to bring your performance into my home. You assumed a man of my habits would be satisfied with the obvious. You assumed I would find the camera, collect a fee for identifying the spy, and return the bird. You did not account for the fact that I find the smell of marjoram on a pelican to be a personal affront to my intelligence." The room was silent again, but the tension had changed. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, it was the heavy, suffocating silence of the end. Holloway looked up, his eyes meeting Wolfe's. "What now?" "Now," Wolfe said, "Archie will take the ledger from the bird, the real ledger, which I suspect is a microfilm strip hidden not in the eye, but within the hollowed-out beak of the mount. Then we will await the authorities. You have disrupted my peace, threatened my assistant, and polluted my atmosphere with the stench of petty corruption. I am done with you." I walked over to the Pelican. With a sharp twist of the beaker detail Wolfe had deduced from the way Penhaligon had nervously touched his own nose during the interview, a small silver cylinder dropped onto the table. It made a tiny, hollow sound as it rolled to Wolfe. He didn't touch it. He simply watched it stop, a small piece of metal that had just brought down a titan. "The police are 5 minutes away," I announced, checking the window. "I can see the lights turning off the avenue." "Good," Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "Tell Fritz to prepare the table. I find that exposure of this magnitude always leaves me with a hollow feeling that only a well-browned roast can fill." The arrival of Inspector Kramer usually sounds like a controlled explosion followed by a lecture on the city's penal code, and today was no exception. He burst into the office with a tale of 3 plainclothesmen, his face already a shade of crimson that suggested his blood pressure was currently a matter for a specialist. He took one look at the snub nose engraver's hand, then at Trenchard huddled in the chair, and finally at the silver cylinder sitting on Wolfe's desk. He didn't say hello. He did not even acknowledge Wolfe was alive. He just pointed a thick finger at the butler. "Drop it, Graves. If that thing even twitches, Yow'll be spending the next 50 years wondering what the sun looks like." Graves, being a professional if nothing else, set the gun on the floor and stepped back with his hands raised. The plainclothesman moved in like a well-oiled machine, and within 2 minutes the room was a symphony of clicking handcuffs. Halloway didn't resist. He stood up with a strange, hollow dignity, letting them lead him toward the door without uttering a single word of protest. It was the silence of a man who knew that every word he'd ever spoken in public was about to be used as a shovel for his own grave. Trenchard was a different story. He started talking before they even got the cuffs on him, offering names, dates, and account numbers in a desperate bid to be the first one to turn state's evidence. Kramer stayed behind, hovering over Wolfe's desk and staring at the silver cylinder. So that's it, the global logistics ledger? We've been chasing the paper trail on those accounts for 6 months, Wolfe. We knew the money was moving, but we couldn't prove who was signing the authorizations. You're telling me it was in the beak of a bird? The beak, Wolfe confirmed, his voice thick with the exhaustion that always follows a successful deduction. A masterwork of hiding in plain sight. Mr. Halloway assumed that the more ridiculous the vessel, the less likely a sophisticated investigator would be to examine its structural integrity. He banked on the idea that I would be distracted by the electronic toy in the eye. He was nearly correct. Had he not violated my home and used his hirelings to crawl across my roof like common burglars, I might have simply returned the bird and sent a bill for my time. Kramer grunted, picking up the cylinder with a handkerchief. You're a piece of work, Wolfe. You sit in this chair, drink your beer, and the Department of State falls into your lap. What about the taxidermist? Is he in on it? Mr. Penhaligon is a victim of his own excellence, Wolfe said, casting a brief, almost sympathetic glance toward the little man. He noticed the eye had been tampered with because he takes pride in his craft. That pride nearly cost him his life. Archie, see to it that Mr. Penhaligon is escorted home safely, and ensure he is compensated for the damage to his pelican. Send the bill to the State Department. I believe they have a surplus in their discretionary fund. I nodded, watching the last of the suspects being led out into the cool evening air. The office felt larger now, the vacuum left by the departing egos and secrets being filled once again by the familiar scent of old books and Fritz cooking. Evelyn Halloway was the last to leave. She stopped at the door, looking back at the massive man behind the desk. You knew it was my uncle all along, didn't you? She asked. I knew someone was desperate, Wolfe replied. In my experience, desperation in high places is rarely the result of a misunderstanding. It is almost always the result of a calculated risk that has begun to sour. Your uncle simply ran out of time, Miss Halloway. I merely accelerated the clock. She nodded slowly and followed the officers. I closed the heavy door and turned the bolt. The silence that followed was heavy and sweet. I looked at the pelican still sitting on its crate. Without its secret ledger and its spy eye, it just looked like a very confused bird that had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Well, I said, leaning against my desk, that's for books. High-level treason, a rooftop commando, and a butler with a grudge. I assume the fee will be enough to keep us in beer and orchids for a while. Wolfe didn't answer. He was staring at the wall, his mind already retreating from the sordid details of human greed. The hollow interior, Archie, that is the theme of the day. Men who build grand facades only to hide the vacuum within. It is an exhausting pursuit. Is the beef ready? Fritz is just plating it, I said, and he promised extra marrow. Wolfe stood up, his great bulk moving with a renewed purpose. The case was closed, justice off a sort had been delivered, and the sanctity of the brownstone was restored. There was nothing left to do but eat. The dining room was illuminated by the soft amber glow of the chandelier, reflecting off the polished mahogany table as if the wood were a dark, still pool. Fritz had outdone himself, presenting a braised beef daub that filled the room with a rich herbaceous steam, accented by the sharp, earthy scent of red wine and peppercorns. Wolfe sat at the head of the table, his napkin tucked into his collar with the precision of a surgeon's drape. He had shed the tension of the afternoon along with his yellow silk shirt, now favoring a deep violet housecoat that made him look like a relaxed emperor presiding over a quiet province. We ate in the civilized silence that Wolfe demands during the first 20 minutes of a meal. To Wolfe, talking while chewing is a betrayal of the palate, a form of multitasking that insults the chef and the cow in equal measure. I didn't mind. I was busy thinking about the way Trenchard's face had crumpled when the silver cylinder hit the desk. It's funny how a man can spend 20 years building a reputation for ironclad reliability, only to have it demolished by a piece of microfilm no larger than a cigarette filter. The marjoram, Archie, Wolfe said finally, after he had finished his second helping of the beef and was contemplating a piece of Stilton. It was the only genuine error in an otherwise meticulous performance. Had Trenchard not been so eager to plant a false trail in our kitchen, he might have escaped my scrutiny for another week. He presumed that by mimicking our household's ingredients, he could make us suspect our own staff, thereby sowing internal discord and distracting us from the bird's physical structure. I sipped my milk and shook my head. It was a gamble. He didn't realize that trying to fool you about spices is like trying to fool a shark about the smell of blood. But what about Graves? You think he was really playing both sides? Or was he just waiting to see who stayed standing? Wolfe used a silver knife to portion a wedge of cheese. Graves is a man of limited imagination but profound survival instincts. He knew the ship was sinking. His new car was not a bribe, it was a severance package he had stolen from the petty cash drawer before the audit began. He held the gun on Holloway not because he had suddenly discovered a moral compass, but because he wished to be the one to hand the captain over to the authorities. It is the oldest strategy in the world, the subordinate sacrificing the superior to buy a seat on the lifeboat. And the pelican? I asked. What happens to the bird of ill omen? Mr. Penhaligon will retrieve it tomorrow, Wolfe replied, his eyes following the slow drip of wine in his glass. I have instructed him to repair the base and the chest cavity. He seemed oddly attached to the creature, although it nearly served as his tombstone. Human affection is often directed at the most inconvenient objects. Wolfe leaned back, the light catching the satisfied curve of his features. The case had been a mess of diplomatic posturing and high-stakes theft, but here, within the 3 feet of stone that made up the brownstone's walls, everything was back in its proper place. The ledger was in Kramer's hands, the suspects were in the tombs, and the orchids were sleeping peacefully under the glass on the roof. You know, I said, leaning back and lighting a cigarette, Holloway actually thought he could win. He really believed that a title and a fancy suit could protect him from a man who hasn't left his house in 3 years for anything less than a national emergency. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something sharp in his gaze. Appetit, Archie, it is the great equalizer. Whether it is a hunger for power, for money, or for a well-cooked meal, it eventually drives a man to reveal himself. Holloway's appetite was for a legacy he hadn't earned, and Trenchard's was for a wealth he couldn't sustain. They were both hollow men, much like their stuffed birds. They spent so much effort preserving the skin that they forgot the interior was rotting. He took a final sip of his wine and signaled to Fritz that he was finished. Ethics are not a garment one wears for public display, Archie. They are the skeletal structure of the soul. Without them, a man is merely a collection of decorative feathers, waiting for a sharp enough wind to blow him away. I grinned and stood up to help Fritz with the tray. Well, at least the feathers in this house are real, even if they are on a pelican. Wolfe didn't smile, but he didn't grumble either. He simply watched the door as I headed toward the office to close out the ledger for the day. The case was over, the night was quiet, and for the first time in 48 hours, the brownstone was exactly as it should, impenetrable, silent, and entirely satisfied with itself.